Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we have a wonderful guest with us. I have Katherine Bennett here. She is a writer for the Catholic Herald. She is a podcaster as well. Her show is Choose Agape, as well as Catholic Unscripted with Mark Lambert and Gavin Ashenden. This is actually one of the first episodes. Well, there's been a few episodes where I've met the person that I'm talking to in person prior to doing an interview. Katherine Bennett was in the Chicagoland area, and I was able to meet her. And thank you for coming on the show.
You're very welcome. It's really lovely of you to invite me on. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. And it was great to meet you just, what must be 2 weeks ago, if that.
It feels like forever ago, though. I don't know how busy you've been, but I feel like it's just been forever.
Yeah. Well, we've been really busy because, of course, going over there, there's a lot of prep to get over there. And then when we were there, we would just have this really busy schedule, and it was all go. We had something built in every day, which was great. And then we've come back, and the jet lag hits you, and return to sort of normal life. We've got a couple of bank holidays over here, so that always throws you because you end up thinking you don't know what day it is. Is it Tuesday? Is it Monday? And throw in lag, and yeah, everything's a bit of a whirlwind. But yeah, so it does feel like longer ago, but we met just 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So one of your most recent episodes of Choose Agape was with Dr. Ed Fazer. So if anybody's interested in that, I'll have a link to that in the description. I'll also have a link to all the podcast stuff, as well as your work at the Catholic Herald. You also have taught religious studies in the English school system, or in the Catholic English school system. So tell us first why you traveled to the Chicagoland area. What was the goal of that trip?
Yeah, sorry. You've caught me with a cough, which isn't the best thing to have when you're doing a podcast. So I keep hoping I'm pressing mute and don't deafen everyone. So the purpose of the trip, so I've been doing this Choose Agape podcast myself for over a year, and it's been fantastic. And I've met some great people through it. You've just mentioned Ed Fazer, who is phenomenal. He's just brilliant. So definitely worth checking out. And through that, I met Gavin, and I already knew Mark, and we got together and began our own separate podcast, which you've mentioned, which is Catholic Unscripted. So we meet, that's a bit newer. So we've been doing that only for about 3 or 4 months. And we meet weekly. The idea is to discuss kind of, what's been thrown up in the news this week, but from a Catholic perspective. And we've also veered into some of the controversies in the Catholic Church and the difference. See, I hate this idea of wings of the church because it's just the church, right? So we're either faithful or we're not. But we discuss some of the kind of, I suppose, controversies in the church, and also a bit of just answering questions, a bit of evangelization. My stepdaughter posed a question, and so we did a whole episode on that, about why God created humans, the purpose of life. Just simple thing like that. So we'd been doing that for a while, and then through some of the work we've all been doing, we connected with this priest over in the US who loved what we were doing, wanted to help make us connections over there and introduce us to some people and give some talks. And it just happened, really providentially, that our calendars were all free at that time, which is quite unusual. And the funding was there, and so we could do it. And so within the space of maybe 3 or 4 weeks, we said yes, got ready, filled in all our forms, and jumped on the plane and arrived there in Chicago to begin this tour of the most fantastic places, the most fantastic churches. And we just had a great visit. We've just done a podcast about it ourselves. Our latest Catholic Unscripted 21 begins with us discussing our trip and how we feel coming back. So it's great.
Yeah. Well, so you visited St. John Cantius. I'm very familiar with the church. What was your experience like visiting that?
Yeah, St John Cantus was just beautiful. It, in fact, we went to Marytown. We went to St Peter's Volo, and we went to St John Cantus and Mary of the Angels as well. All of them stunningly beautiful churches. But it was at St John Cantus that I broke down. That everywhere we went, I was really moved by the beauty, by the reverence. But when we arrived at St John Cantus and we had dinner with the canons, and that was really lovely. And then they showed us around, and it was just so beautiful. We're just hit by the art, the architecture, the relics. We went through all the cabinets of relics, and we're just stunned by what they have, because of course the whole charism is to restore the sacred. So there was just such a sense of that sacred that is so lost, really. I mean, certainly lost in our culture, but even to some extent in the church, we've lost some of that reverence and that recognition of the sacred. So I thought it was absolutely wonderful, and I did bawl like a baby. And the men sort of looked at me and said, "What's wrong with you?" And the answer was, "I don't know," because it wasn't a conscious thing. I was just completely broken. The beauty of it just broke in, just penetrated in that way, which is not a totally unique experience, because my journey is one of reverting to the Catholic faith, reverting back, because I was raised a Catholic and then fell away in my 20s, which is quite a familiar story. But I would say the first thing that really shifted me back was a visit to Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which, if anyone knows, is the most stunning church. It's just breathtaking. And I went in, and I, at the time, would have called myself an atheist. And I was just visiting museums and churches and, as a tourist. And I went in, and I was just hit with that beauty, and I fell to my knees, and tears were just streaming down my face. And it was that same thing at St John Cantius. It's that you just recognize truth, beauty, and goodness. It's the transcendentals. It's just that same experience. So overwhelmingly wonderful was our experience.
You were a bit spoiled with, for the most part, for which churches you visited. We do
Yeah.
have plenty of ugly churches, just so you know.
Oh, good. Yeah. I did hear, a father did tell us about, I think it was a church local to him, where there was a blessing with a guitar, and the priest actually held up the guitar and did the blessing. And
Yep.
I don't know, maybe some of the stuff that we see, some rainbows here and there. So yeah, I'm aware that it was a selective group, but it was beautiful.
Yeah. Well, how does that contrast to the church situation in England? Because I know all the churches were stolen, of course,
Mm.
and many have been built since. Are there like, I think back in the day, people would be going to mass in not really churches. So are people usually going to mass in churches in England for Catholics?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what you say is true, and so a lot of the oldest, most beautiful, and architecturally and so on, all these churches are are no longer Catholic. But there are. I mean, it is possible to create beautiful spaces in the modern world. Roger Scruton, will talk about beauty and architecture, and how there's no need to have this sort of soulless, cold design. But so it is possible, but there's a mixture. It's a mixed bag. There are some wonderful churches, really beautiful, really well, really crafted, designed, thought through, thought out, with Christ at the center. But there are just a lot of pretty horrible modern churches, churches in the round, bleak. There's no sense of, there really isn't a sense of, I mean, Christ is there nonetheless. Mass is mass. It doesn't matter. But that beauty that helps to draw us in is missing. and it's a real shame. And the thing is, people respond to their environment, you know, and it's the same with our clothes, isn't it? People sometimes get themselves in a twist about why do we care what people wear? Just wear what you want. But in fact, how we dress as well helps us to behave in a certain way. I think, you know, that idea of modesty, and when we surround ourselves with ugliness, it's sort of, we miss something. So yeah, it's a real shame. And people in these ugly buildings, what you sometimes get is chit chat. Do you get that? You know, you go in and people are chit chatting. What did you do at the weekend? Or how's work? Lovely. How's your son and daughter? Yeah, they're fine. And they're just chatting. And there doesn't seem to be that awe and that reverence and that silence that the beauty calls us to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard I heard a quote recently that basically said because there aren't any like there hadn't been many persecutions as of recent, that the only way to for Catholics to still suffer is bad liturgies and ugly churches. So that's our way of suffering for the faith, even when there's not a direct persecution.
Yeah, I mean, we offer it up, right? And we don't stamp our feet and say, well, I'm not going then, because that isn't ultimately what it's about. But yeah, it's true. The blood of the martyrs are the seeds of the church. We're spoiled in many ways. So the one way in which it is difficult is in perhaps in this way of struggling with these ugly buildings and what it produces.
Yeah. So and you know, there's kind of a new persecution coming, at least with this sort of woke progressive ideologies. How is that affecting the Catholic schools?
Well, we have a different system to you. I don't know if I fully understand yours. I got more of an idea when we were over in America just recently. We have, by and large, state-funded Catholic schools. So the church, you know, there's the contribution to land and upkeep, but the schooling, the staff are all paid for by the state. So through tax, they're public sector, we'd call them.
Hmm.
And and that's great that we can have publicly funded Catholic schools. It means there's schools for everyone. You're not excluded because you can't afford a Catholic school, a Catholic education. That's great, but it's only great if you're able to be authentically and truthfully Catholic. And for it wasn't great when I was growing up. So I grew up in the 80s, and that wasn't a great time in Catholic education. But I think it's fair to say, in many ways, it's actually got worse as the culture around us has got more extreme. It's leaking into the schools. It's sort of popping up in Catholic education. And I think the problem is, because our schools are state funded, there's always that tension, you know, where you feel you kind of feel, well, you have to kind of harmonize somehow with the spirit of the age and welcome everyone as they are. And there's a fear. I talk about this with Ed Fazer, so well worth listening to that chat. But there's a fear of standing too firmly on your faith where it's seen to be at odds with the culture. Now, the thing is, it isn't really at odds with the culture. There's an answer to these things if we are prepared to examine our faith and understand it. But it's easy just to say, oh, well, you know, the church is traditional, stuck in the mud, out of date, out of touch. So we'll go to these sort of modern ideologies instead and bring those in, and then say a Hail Mary and have a statue of Our Lady. So it's become, in many schools, I'm afraid, a bit of an add-on, you know, holy water, sign of the cross, statue, rather than absolutely central to everything we do.
Yeah, isn't that what kind of syncretism is, where you uh sort of you're doing the same things, but you're really embracing this kind of other belief system.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is what I remember having a conversation with a head teacher, and I said I'd complained so that do quite a bit of complaining, and and I was saying, well, why are we teaching this, and why are we delivering this? This is really antithetical to our faith. And the response back was, well, we want to remain open as a Catholic school in order to provide a Catholic education, and if we don't adopt this or you know celebrate this, then we may get closed down. And the problem with that is, well, what do you stay if you compromise so much that you actually are no longer offering anything but what the culture's offering? Why stay open at all? So yeah, that's syncretism. That's exactly the problem.
Yeah. And so but there's no literal pressure from the states from the government to like regarding what what the Catholic schools are teaching. Or is there pressure by law or by I don't know, some form of pressure outside of that?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think a lot of it is felt pressure
Okay.
rather than actual. So I know that there are heads and there are deputies and there are leaders in Catholic schools who are just very worried about somebody going to the press and saying Catholic teachers homophobic, Catholic schools homophobic, Catholic schools racist. Catholic school teaches that women should be in the home, and they're so it's that felt pressure of being so worried that they are desperate to avoid that at all costs. So we've had people come in from Catholic agencies and do fantastic days leading this certain topics for certain year groups, and then in Q&A they'll be asked questions, and an obvious one that young people always ask is the Catholic is something about homosexuality, and of course the Catholic answers in line with the Catholic faith about loving the person and like in all matters of sex it should be within marriage only. And there's a massive panic breaks out. Oh my goodness, we've suggested to the children that being homosexual is wrong. Let's never have this group in again. So it's not necessarily, you're right, it's not necessarily that there is a restriction or direction in that sense, but that felt pressure is enough to capitulate. And that won't happen where you have well-formed, faithful Catholic leaders in schools. But the problem is we don't have enough of those. We don't have enough of those in teaching, and it's getting worse because in education, in secondary education, so that's ages 11 up to 18, we used to allow 4 A-level options, which is you'd study at a greater breadth. You wouldn't narrow so quickly, and then for financial reasons, there was a move to narrow the curriculum. And so people used to always take theology or philosophy as another when you had a broader choice. And then what they'd find is they just took it as a little extra, but they ended up loving it. And so they'd go on and study at university and do theology and become very well formed in certainly in theology and philosophy, if not necessarily in the Catholic faith. And they're not doing that now. And so people aren't going on to study theology, and when they're not studying it, they're not going on to train to teach. And so what you have now often is people teaching religion, which is, we have religion in state schools over here, who are PE teachers. They've got a degree in sport or in geography. So they're not specialists, and they don't know their faith. They don't love their faith. They're not formed in their faith. And it's not really their fault. You just can't get the teachers. Where there is fault is when you know that you can't get faithful teachers, is there should be more emphasis on formation once the teacher has been appointed. And that's where schools are really lacking, is they're not then following up with a really intentional programme of formation for Catholic teachers or teachers in a Catholic school.
Yeah, this seems to be a problem of catechesis. But you brought up them worried about the people going to the press and attacking the Catholic Church or whatever. It's just funny. It's like Catholic, or so who's the head? What's the name of the head of the school? What's that position called?
Yeah, so the highest position in the school would be the head teacher.
Yeah, the head teacher worried about like a headline says Catholic school teaches Catholicism.
I mean, I know, right? Exactly. That's what I find quite amusing is what's to worry about? What's the big news story here? Shock, horror, Catholic school teaches Catholic faith. It is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. But that is why the problem is really that I think that's why we were so bowled over by this restore the sacred at when we visited Chicago recently. Is actually that's what's lost. Is there really a belief in God? Is there real belief in sacredness, in sanctity, in supernatural, in something beyond the natural and the material? And if that's not there, then you're not going to rock the boat for anything. It's a real shame.
And it's kind of like, what do you even lose if the worst comes to pass? Like what's the worst these head teachers are thinking is going to happen? And then like, is it really that bad even if the worst thing happens?
Yeah, well, it's true. I think the thing that they fear most is being shut down. And as you say, and I agree with you to some extent, you say, well, burn it all down then, shut it all down. If either we stand on truth or we fall, but we don't compromise. And so I think there's something to be said for that. But they are, so I know people working in Catholic education who say, well, we just want kids to have a good experience of the Catholic faith, to leave school and think that was nice. People liked me. I felt, no, seriously, people liked
It's
me.
just
I liked
funny.
it. It felt good. I came away feeling good and feeling cared for. And they say, and then what will happen is down the line, they'll have that memory of being in a Catholic school, and so they'll remain Catholic. But the thing is, we've got a professor over here called Professor Stephen Bullivant. You may have heard of him. He's a professor at St Mary's University in South London, and he's fantastic. He's a religious sociologist. That sounds like something I've made up, but I'm sure there's a proper title. But he's just written a book called Mass Exodus about disaffiliation in the Catholic Church.
A
And
great title.
great
Mass.
title,
Mass.
very funny as well.
Yes,
He's really
yes.
dry and eccentric and brilliant. He's also associated with the Catholic Herald, but he has this great phrase, which is, if you give young people a weak sort of, I can't remember it word for word, version of Catholicism, then you inoculate them against the live strain. In other words, it's almost worse to give them this, oh, well, let's just make them feel nice and think that the Catholic faith is a happy memory, and then they'll be faithful Catholics the rest of their life. Well, they won't. They just won't ever catch that, be on fire for the truth, because they weren't given it.
Who knew that the same mentality of a school would be the same mentality of, like, I don't know, a sporting event? Oh, it was
Yeah,
nice. It was enjoyable. Like
yeah,
those aren't that's not the purpose of education. I
yeah,
mean, isn't the purpose of of education is to uh teach kids the truth,
yeah,
and also prepare them for their future life?
yeah. I think you've hit the nail absolutely on the head, and this is the problem. It's purpose. We don't know I mean, we know, and Catholic leaders should know, um, but we say, okay, well, let's have a think. What is a human person? How does one educate a human person? We're not educating hedgehogs and frogs and rabbits. We're educating humans. So we have to know what is the end so that we know what we're directing them towards. And of course, we know that we are destined to be saints. So we need to grow in holiness. We need to aim for heaven, aim heavenward. And so once we have that, we can work backwards from that and say, well, that's the purpose. So now how do we get there? That will then inform and should inform how we educate young people. But with this is likely the same where you are, but instead we've shifted all that out. We push that to one side and we say, well, what matters is that you get exam grades. It's like an exam factory. We just want you to get good exam grades, and we want to churn you out so that you can be solicitors and doctors and lawyers and whatever other prestigious career that we might want to shove you into. But I asked only recently a deputy head here, okay, so you want the young people to do well in their exams, great. Why? Oh, to go to university. Okay, why to go to university? Oh, so that they can study and get a good job. Okay, and why do they need a good job? Doing that sort of Aristotelian subordinate and superior aims. And there came a point where he just looked blank. I said, but why are they doing any of it? Why do they need a good job? And he looked at me like no one had ever asked him that question. Well, what that's all it's about, isn't it? Go and get a good job. And so once you lose, or you're not clear on what that purpose is, then yes, education becomes about something else. And what we also have a real problem with in our schools here is that they're very political. And actually, there's a law that says schools are just breaking the law, just blatantly breaking the law. Like people are walking down the street smoking pot, and you can smell it on every corner. It's apparently illegal, but everyone's doing it. So similarly, schools are just full, might be an exaggeration, but the majority are politically left-leaning teachers who make no bones about their beliefs, and the young people before them are sort of often like little guinea pigs for them to pass on their politics, which is just so wrong, and it's so unfair on the children. I remember when it was your Trump election, who was he up against? Clinton.
Hillary Clinton, yeah.
Back in the day, was that 2016?
Yep.
And the kids, the older kids, were saying to me, Miss, what do you think about the Trump-Clinton election? Who would you vote for? And of course, I said, well, I'm not telling you who I would vote for. You can discuss it if you want, but the idea is that we remain politically neutral and impartial. And one of them said to me, oh, come on, Miss, everyone else has. And this teacher, they did. They said, oh, this teacher thinks this, and this teacher thinks this, and this teacher's a communist. And I said, well, I refuse to be drawn. I refuse to be drawn. So we have a real problem. Basically, we've lost a sense of purpose, and schools have become places that have become too political. And we're using the curriculum. We're decolonizing the curriculum after the George Floyd death and all the stuff that came out of that about racial justice. We're doing girls only programs to right the wrongs of the patriarchy. So all of this within schools, we haven't got time to be looking at the classics.
What does decolonization look like? I can't imagine. It sounds ridiculous.
I was really hoping you wouldn't ask me that, because although I know it's something we're doing, I've paid such little attention to it. It's so part of what we're doing is we'll have to look through the history curriculum, the geography curriculum, the English curriculum, and say, is there enough representation of Black people, people of colour? And so you'll study the Victorians in history, but it won't be the Victorians, it will be Black Victorians. So you'll study Black Victorians, and there's all sorts of ways like this that we're changing the curriculum to fit a more modern, progressive mindset.
So they're changing history.
They're saying we're looking at it more broadly than we used to, and that's a good thing.
So they're looking at, like, if you have history, you have like 99% or 99.9% of history is, in England, obviously would be white people, just because English people, they'd be English people, right? So they're looking at the 0.1%, but they're making the 0.1% 50% or something like that of the curriculum they cover. Is that kind of what it is?
Yeah, there is definitely an inflation that doesn't match so it's made more prominent. There's nothing wrong, in a sense, with I can see the good intention of these things. I can see the good intention of saying to young women, you've played a vital part in history. Let's raise women in the curriculum and Black people. I can understand the good intention, but it's a bit like having Black History Month, which we also have, and then Gay History Month or something. You know, there's always these months, and the intention is we're really being kind and inclusive, but it's also quite insulting because we're just humans. You know, we're just human beings, and I think it's quite patronizing as well to do this.
Well, it's just like Netflix is coming out with a documentary on Cleopatra, and Cleopatra's Black in it.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to care that the Egyptians think it's ridiculous. Nobody cares to think that, oh, Cleopatra was Greek,
Yeah.
like
I mean,
what she was. But it's like, you know, it's like this. I think I've listened to a bunch of different English news and stuff like that over the last I become strangely an Anglophile over the course of the last couple of years. Not in the conventional way that people become Anglophiles or something like that, where you just get excited about all the pageantry and all that stuff, or like, you know, the accents and stuff like that. Uh but one of the things was like David Starkey was talking about like a story that they've been teaching about this Black woman who I think it was like they said she started the first like hospital or whatever in the Crimean War or whatever. And it's like, and these historians are trying to say, oh, she's this, like, she's the real first nurse or whatever, that other than, who's like the main one that's usually touted?
Florence Nightingale.
What, Florence Nightingale, is that who it is?
Let's say yeah.
I think so. I think that sounds right. But anyways, but David Starkey points out, like, this woman went to the Crimean War to make money, and she failed at that. Or she either failed at it or became successful. I can't remember. But the point was that her motivations were all about money. And Florence Nightingale's motivations were to help sick people or whatever. So it's just, and also this woman, I think it was only for the rich or whatever. It was like, but so it's like that type of thing. It's like you're just pointing out a story, but you're not giving the context of what the meaning of the story actually is.
Yeah, and this is where I think it becomes patronizing, because if you just say we've got to raise the profile of Black people, let's just pluck any old Black person, or just because they're Black, it's just so insulting. And you see it. We've just celebrated International Women's Day, and by we I mean everyone else. And I wrote about it for the Herald, and what a sham it is. And on International Women's Day, we had things sent around schools, reading lists, and people to celebrate, including men who are now identifying as women. And
Not Jane Austen.
It's so insulting.
It
Well, I
wasn't.
mean, yeah, you know, let's celebrate Jane Austen too. But
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Like, you know,
yeah,
but you know what? She's probably not good for International Women's Day, because the people she criticizes the most are women
yeah. I
in her
mean,
stories.
yeah, exactly. We can't have that. Goodness, no.
No.
I mean, we can have men say they're women, but we can't have women criticize women. Um, but it's true. We had just last summer. Joan of Arc is transgender. She's actually. We've had Anne Boleyn is Black, and the irony, of course, with all of these things, hypocrisy that there'd be outrage, you know, if it were the other way around. So we have to deal with all of that. It's the incoherence of lies, and people are starting to see it, I think, in all sorts of ways, with all lies thrown at us. You notice when you teach and you do share truth with them, or you help reveal truth, is that they recognize it and they're thirsty for it, and they can start to see the incoherence of what they're being presented with in the culture.
Well, the thing about like these months of focusing on different history or whatever is,
Yeah.
you know, you only have such limited time with it, with children, teaching them history or you know, anything, pretty much literature. You have to be very specific about and mindful about what stuff you teach, like, or what you focus on, because if you're teaching the Victorian era, shouldn't you focus on the most important aspects of the Victorian era? If you're not teaching about Queen Victoria, are you really like are you really teaching about the Victorian era?
Yeah, and I suppose the response to that would be, well, that's what what then it begs the question, well, what do you think are the most important aspects, and are you informed by some kind of supremacy, or and what's informing your belief? And then, because everything's relative, it's then, well, why does your belief trump mine? And that's why it's so important to just anchor everything in truth. And in a Catholic school, we should be able to say, well, we know what truth is, and so this is the spine. What does a geography lesson look like when you believe that God created the world? And what does a science lesson look like when you believe that God created the world? That should inform everything. So
Well,
yeah, it's yeah, mad.
it's kind of like in the United
And it's
States.
not, and it's also,
Sorry, in the United States, like, we have this thing that has always sort of ruined or influenced Catholic education, where even with Catholics, we start history with the birth of America, or with Puritanism. That's in history. That would be the
right.
first Christians we'd learn about, even though those are probably the worst Christians you could possibly start with in regards to teaching, like, the origins of Christianity. I mean, you start with people with a Christian group that basically started in I mean, Calvin, 1500s,
Yeah,
1600s England, but you don't act, you're going to confuse all of the kids. The first things they're going to think about with Christianity is Puritanism.
yeah,
And then they're not Puritans anyways, even in Catholic, if this is in Catholic school, which I experienced because I went to Catholic school.
yeah,
This is the kind of thing we learn about. Like, you don't
yeah,
learn about, uh, if you want to teach history, the only reason why you should teach history is to teach people about how you got there, how you got to where you are, and for that purpose, you have to go back. You have to go very far back, and of course, if you're in Asia, you have to go far back into Asian history. But with Americans or with the English, you have to start basically with either with, like, ancient civilizations, because that's really
mm,
the where civilization came from in the Western world, in Christendom.
yeah, yeah,
And
it's true.
yeah, so I mean, if you're trying to give a child an understanding of what history matters to them because of who they are, you're not going to go to these obscure things, because obscurity has the least effect on the people of the time. If you're looking at somebody who, like, sold like 10 books, like, like, if you're looking at a like you need to read the classics, because if you're going to understand literature of the time, you're not going to look at the person who sold 10 books in that time period. You're going to
Yeah,
look at the person who sold, I don't know, 20,000 books.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it seems ludicrous to me to just, go on this weird, like, it's like going on these many, like, what is it? Tangents that don't
yeah.
actually connect with the grander understanding of history.
Yeah, I agree. It seems it. I mean, obviously, there's only so much you can fit in, and you have to prioritize. But you're quite right. If you do have to prioritize, then you have to make it about what's really going to be more important for understanding more broadly, or is it just ideological and trying to make an ideological point? And how useful is that? And again, that all goes back to purpose. Useful for what end? So for us to understand ourselves as the kind of being we are, um, this is why story is so important, and myth, and the creation myth. And now with scientism, this sort of over emphasis on materialism and scientism, something like the creation story is just brushed aside as a make believe, without any real understanding about what myth means. And so story, choosing the right literature, choosing the right story can be a huge window into truth itself, but in a way that you're not proselytizing.
Yeah.
When we were with you guys over in Chicago, we met the head of Chesterton Academy, which we were so impressed with him and their project. And he was saying when they choose their books, they're saying, okay, let's look at Frankenstein, and the kids look at Frankenstein and they say man turns to science and it fails him. And then they say the next book, they say man turns to the occult and it fails him. And then we look at 1984 and we say, man, this is where man's heading and it's going to fail. So you're exposing all those truths, but through very carefully considered and intentional literature, the classics, these sort of classic texts. If your idea is to try and teach someone to accept two men can have a baby, then you'll choose a different text. But that, so that everything is informed by your sense of what by purpose. What is it you're trying to achieve in educating these young people? And it should be in truth about who they are.
And you were talking about, you got a little bit of a vision of what education looks like in the United States. And for my English viewers, I'll give a little bit of an idea. So the way things are structured over here is that we have schools, government schools, where people pay their taxes into these schools, and it's run by districts, and we elect the people that oversee the school. It's like a school board, that's what we call it. And then we elect those people, and then they're separately mostly diocesan run, but there are Catholic schools that that are more expensive because they are not subsidized by the government. And even when my understanding is, even when you send your kids to these Catholic schools, you still have to pay a portion of your tax money to the public schools. So money doesn't usually follow the student. That's something people have been trying to push for over the past years. I mean, it's somewhere. I think it's in some places available, but the United States is so varied regarding its laws by states, that it might be different in different places. And those Catholic schools have often been trying to sort of be public schools, or be government-run schools, but just with some Catholicism added in. It's not too dissimilar. It's more of just like a prestigious thing, it's more like, because it's privately owned, then it has some prestige, and there's this inner battle between. And then all my understanding is, at least in my area, all the high schools are run independent Catholic schools, and they're the ones that fall victim very often to sliding into sort of this wokery and stuff like that. And there's this constant internal battle. And then there's these Chesterton schools and homeschooling and that sort of thing that is growing. So classical education is growing. And then there are other private schools that aren't Catholic schools, some classical education. Classical education and homeschooling is definitely on the rise in the United States. It's interesting because you guys are the originators of the classical education, but it sounds like that's not the standard in England.
No, I think, well, education's changed a lot over the sort of centuries, but certainly in the last few decades. We have a comprehensive system, and there's always battles over education and what should be done, and it's always a hot topic in when there's a general election coming. What's the stance on education? And we have things called grammar schools here, where you get in on merit. So it doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich; they're free schools, but you get in on merit. And people say that they're unfair, and have wanted to close them down. Other people think they're good. You lost a lot of that classical education when we had the like these comps, and there was an emphasis that I'm trying to think, there would have been more of an emphasis around the sort of 70s, 80s on things like hairdressing and building and things like this. So you'd have more of an idea that you have to equip students for jobs in that way, you know, so for vocational studies, those kinds of things. So there's always a battle between what is it just a waste of time, you know, studying the classics and philosophy and theology and these things, and are we better off educating our young people? So that I know schools that have hair salons in them, and they choose GCSE hairdressing.
That's a
So
bit odd.
yeah, well, and then they'd say, well, is it that odd because these young people want to be hairdressers, and so why waste your time reading Faust when you can do highlights? And there's an argument for that. I think there's an argument for that. That to some extent, I think in the 90s, under Tony Blair, there was a push to have 50% of people go to university. And in a way, I thought that's also problematic. I can, again, good intention, but it's become so everything's been it's not exclusive. It's like anyone, like now everyone does a degree, and so you need a master's to stand out. And now everyone's doing a master's, so you need a PhD. Standards have kind of slipped because it's just a case of let's see how many people we can get into that tertiary education, to that level of education. So you do have some schools that do have more of a classical education, but they're far fewer than you would have done, and a lot of them will be the older independent schools. But even there, you know, you're finding, even at Eton and schools like this, you're hearing of the same problems, the same calls for, you know, feminism and things like that, even at these classical schools.
Wasn't there a Catholic teacher fired from Eton recently?
I did hear something about that a year or so ago, and I can't remember. There was a Bernard Randall, I think. There's another one.
I know Seamus Coughlin had him on his show over on Rumble.
Right.
So it's very interesting. And Eton is an all boys school, isn't it?
Eton still is,
Yeah.
which is rare because a lot of schools, a lot of old boys' schools have become, and the Catholic schools too, Ampleforth, the old boys' schools have became co-educational in the last few decades. So that's another thing. You have to be inclusive. So it's very rare to find male-only spaces now and female-only spaces now. So even in brownies and scouts, these things that boys used to go off and build fires and camp, and girls used to do the same with girls. Now scouts have to allow girls in, and again, it's because it's trying to fit this diversity, inclusivity, equality, but without really understanding what that means, because a girl is not a boy and a boy is not a girl, and whilst they're both equally valuable and loved, they are not the same thing, as it were, the same created thing, and so the same solutions will not apply.
It's really amazing that like people didn't see the transgender thing coming, actually. Like because basically if you set things up where there's no difference in the way you treat men and women, then you're going to and in some ways feminism really created the transgender movement by making women men.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I'm with Alice von Hildebrand, who I think is fantastic, phenomenal author and speaker and philosopher, writer. She who says feminism is the death of femininity, and we now have this idea that actually being a feminist, to right the wrongs of the patriarchy and the way in which women have been treated, we have to get more women CEOs, and and let girls be scouts. Sorry. And all these things we've said, and let girls into boys' schools, and let's make it fair. And of course, without realizing that, in fact, what you're doing is you're celebrating masculinity. You're not really celebrating femininity. You're saying women are only valuable when they emulate men. And there's actually, we also struggle with the idea of femininity and masculinity as cosmic principles of all creation. We get too hooked on the idea of the female and the male, when in fact the female is a physical embodiment of the feminine principle, and male is the embodiment of the masculine principle. But the principles exist outside of the male and female body, and so I think as we celebrate women only when we recognize their role as equal to men, then we lose femininity. And actually, I would say a lot of the problems we have in our culture today are down to femininity. As we become more artificial, we have this godless masculinity and artificiality. And we've lost that secret, reverent, sacred space that is woman, that is feminine, that is the question, where all these symbolisms of femininity we've lost.
That's it's also, making women masculine. It's also lessened the masculinity of men. Men are also told they can't be masculine.
This is true. And that they should be ashamed of their masculinity. And again, we go back to schools, because let's be honest, the schools are where we're raising the next generation, and this is why it matters so much what we do in schools. And in schools, there are programs to, actually, it's an international problem that boys are underachieving. It's a national problem, and it's an international problem that girls are succeeding in school and in university, and boys are underachieving. They have low attainment, and we're getting our heads together, and we're having committees about what can we do to raise levels of attainment for boys. And the answers coming forward are, well, they have to be more like girls, because girls are succeeding. And so, again, as you say, there's that, it's not recognizing what a boy is. Why might a boy not be attaining? Why are boys in their bedrooms jerking off, watching porn and playing video games? Let's be honest. Let's just be totally honest about it. Why are they? Because they're redundant. Because they're being told, you're useless, you're redundant, you're to blame for everything. Sorry, boys, step aside. It's time for the women to rise up the ranks. It's no wonder everything's just completely turned on its head. And in the Garden of Eden, of course, this is where it began, this rupture began that we're seeing now, all has its roots there, where as we disobey God and we separate man from God, man from woman, body from soul. And so this separation runs right through creation, and it can only be restored in Christ. It can only be restored if we look Christward. The healing of the harmony between men and women, and between body and soul. So yes, the transgender movement is the inevitable consequence of that fall, and that inability to harmonize and to align body and soul. Men and women, of course, are tugging war against each other. Not all men and not all women, but this is all part of the same problem. That lack of harmony.
You brought us back to Eden, and I think it's genius, because in the manosphere and sort of this, I don't know if you've heard of Andrew Tate.
Yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that area.
He's a Muslim, I think, isn't he?
What?
I think he's a Muslim, is he, Andrew Tate?
He became a Muslim recently.
Okay. Yeah.
But he sort of the embodiment of the negative sort of manhood that has come out of that started in Eden as well, with sort of that mentality has been basically to blame women.
Yeah.
So while in Eden, Eve took charge, and that's sort of where things began to go wrong with the snake. Well, when man takes the apple, or takes the fruit, and falls into sin as well, God comes to him and says, why did you, what have you done? And he's like, this woman gave it to me. The woman gave it to me. It's her fault. And also you gave me her, so it's your fault.
Or whatever. Yeah, blame the woman. Where's the woman?
Blame the woman, and I blame God.
Yeah.
And that is basically the mentality of like the manosphere. If you follow this sort of fake masculinity, you basically get into that mentality, and then you've fallen into the feminist mentality. You've been broken by feminism, and you don't have any, you don't you become a user of women.
Yeah, such important points, because actually the danger in everything is to unbalance and tip and be lopsided too far one extreme. And often in trying to correct a past injustice, we overcorrect and create an equal but opposite injustice. And with men, of course, you're quite right. There's that idea, well, if we're going to be reduced and feminism's done this, then we're going to kick back even harder and be really aggressive men, and we're going to take women, and we're going to, porn and use and women are objects, and all of that kind of that genuine toxic maleness that you do get, because, and that's the other thing, if we could just try and show in our faith that Christ is the perfect model of a man. Christ, who elevated women, who used the term daughters of Abraham, that just wasn't used. This just wasn't a term used at all. Who in teaching about marriage and divorce did not support this idea that women could be tossed aside for any and every reason. So Jesus, of course, elevated women, and of course we can talk about our Lady as well. But he also was so strong and courageous and tough, and well, he's God, he's got that on his side. But
fully man, so he's
fully man. So that perfect,
Yeah.
that hypostatic union of fully man and fully God. And so Christ is the model. And what are we told in Ephesians? Tell me if I'm wrong. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. How should I love my wife? You should flip him well, suffer and sacrifice and be willing to give your life for love of her. But instead we get hooked on that little bit that says, wives, submit to your husbands. What? I'm not submitting to my husband. Don't pay attention to the fact that your husband has been told to love you like Christ loves the church. That's pretty big. So yes, we get hung up on this, but the answer, as with everything, is in our faith, and is keeping our eyes fixed on Christ. And young men, when I teach young men about the real Christ, the real Jesus of the Gospels, not the one they've heard snippets about, or just the emphasis on love one another and dance around Galilee, skipping hand in hand with his apostles, which they do get.
That's a thing.
Well, and colouring books of Jesus. That, I did hear a priest, goodness, I hate to say this, say to the young people that the centurion who came to Jesus was asking him to come and heal his gay lover. And so the holiest part of Mass, when we say, I'm not worthy to receive you, but just say the word and I will be healed, comes from Jesus. Well, I know. So you get all of this. You get all of this.
But like, it's slave, isn't it?
Yeah, but the thing is, if you want to, you can read your Marxism or your gender ideology. You can read it into the gospel if you're so minded to.
How do you
it's
get,
that. I don't know.
How do you get gay lover from slave?
I don't know,
But
I know that it's happened.
That's so ridiculous.
Yeah, it is so ridiculous.
Oh,
it is
that's
because
it's crazy.
It's a way to justify your position. You'll try anything to try and justify your position. So yeah, I think looking at Christ is the model. And when I've taught young men the real Jesus in the gospel, I haven't even taught them. I've just presented them with who Christ really is through the word of God. They're like, whoa, this guy's pretty good, And these are young men who are quite drawn and have spoken to me about being drawn to Islam. understandably, because
Really?
they see Islam and they see that it's tough and they see that it calls something from them, and it's calls them to to something where they have to sacrifice and they have to uh, defend and they have to observe. And what they haven't seen is this is all also in our own faith. This liturgical calendar of feast and fast and that go with the natural rhythms of the body, and that we're called to sacrifice and for love of another. That's all in our own faith, but they're missing it, and so they're drawn elsewhere. So we're in great danger of losing young people because we're just not bothered uh, to, to to reveal truth to them.
Well, aren't they missing the part of Islam? Isn't one of the things promised to men in heaven in Islam, like some 100 virgins or whatever in heaven?
I don't
Isn't
know, something like that.
isn't that something? And if that's the case, like how abusive to women Islam can be, like the sort of the. I mean, Islam is really just a corruption of early Christianity in certain places. Um, but it's just interesting because it's like the sacrificial nature of it. But then I think once like you get to heaven, you get all these like materialist pleasures in Muslim heaven. It's in Catholic heaven, of course, in true heaven, your gift is the beatific vision. Your
Yeah,
gift is being with God, and and it's not like this weird like physical pleasure element that is rooted in Islam.
yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about Islam. I teach Islam at a very basic level, but I don't know enough
Hmm.
about it to comment intelligently on it, I don't think. However, I know a number of wonderful Muslims themselves, and I know that there are many aspects of Islam that are beautiful. That it is false is an important point. But I think Peter Crave says there's a lot to respect and admire about Islam, and he says they have um, the cross without Christ, and the problem with too many Christians is they have Christ without the cross, and so Christians need to realize that being a Christian means carrying your cross. And of course, Muslims, we in dialogue, one hopes one can explore that and say, well, you've got the cross, but here's Christ in charitable dialogue with our brothers and sisters.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah,
Thank you, Catherine, for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It was great meeting you as well a couple weeks ago. So I'll have links again to both Catholic Unscripted and Choose Agape. Really check out that Ed Phaser episode. It's a really great one.
yeah.
Uh, and also links to the Catholic Herald. Is there anything else?
No, I think that's it. You've said I write for the Herald, so my pieces you can find there. If you look up my name, Katherine Bennett, I write on a lot of these things: education, culture war stuff, all through the lens of our faith. And Gavin, my colleague on Unscripted, and Mark also write for the Herald, so you'll find lots of good pieces there. Ed Phaser interview, fantastic. He's just remarkable. And I also spoke with Jonathan Pajot last March, so he was also very, very good on some of these things, the symbolism and so on. But
And
it's just
Calvin
been,
Robinson as
and
well, right?
Calvin Robinson, he's great. There's so many wonderful people, and I should say, in fact, that even in education where there are these problems and issues, I would say it's very rarely down to people willfully trying to undermine the faith. I think a lot of it is just ignorance, and so that's why it's so important to try and look for opportunities to catechize
Oh,
or to form. Yeah.
before we go, you and your colleagues are creating a group called Dice, which is the defending the integrity of Catholic education, and you have a conference coming up.
Yeah. So this is quite embryonic. We're just in discussions at the moment, looking at how we might be able to do this and gather the right people involved in the project, and we've got some fantastic people. We've got Ryan Christopher of ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, and he's taken on some great, huge cases over here, including the young woman who was arrested for praying outside an abortion clinic. So he's great, and he's going to be talking about legal responsibilities in Catholic schools. And we have Gavin himself, Monsignor Michael Nazarali. So our first conference is, I'm not sure when this will go out, but we're recording now on the May the something 5th.
It will come out tomorrow.
It'll come out tomorrow. So the conference we're doing is at Stonyhurst, which is a beautiful old Catholic school in Preston, north of England, and northwest, I want to say, but my geography is absolutely appalling.
Preston, Scotland, right? Is it Scotland?
No, I don't think it's not Scotland, but
No,
it's somewhere up there.
Right.
It's north of Watford, so for me, it's all the same. But
I'm not the. I know a decent amount of English geography, but not enough.
But it's there on the 12th, 13th, 14th. It's that weekend after the coronation weekend. Up there, all the details are on the website. If you go to the Christian Heritage Centre, if anyone's interested to come, they're working in Catholic education. It would be fantastic. So it's a pilot. It's an inaugural conference, and we'll see how it goes. But yeah, we're just trying to do some small thing to try and help Catholic schools and defend their integrity.
Sounds good. Awesome. Check out all those events and places and videos and podcasts. Thank you all for watching. I'll be back on Monday. I plan to do something for the coronation. I'm working on putting together the group of, so look for that in the near future, and God bless. Bye.